Julian Frost's fingers hovered over the piano keys. The grand piano before him gleamed under the dim, solitary light. Its black surface reflected the shadows that crept across the room. Julian's hand shook as he let his fingers fall, gently pressing the first note of his composition. The melody rang out, a soft, aching sound, like a distant memory struggling to escape the depths of his mind. The music was his only companion, his only solace. Each note echoed the tumultuous, fragmented pieces of his life. It was a language he understood better than any other, a language that allowed him to confront his past without ever speaking a word. His apartment was minimalistic, cold even. Nothing in the room suggested warmth or comfort. It was a reflection of his inner turmoil, his disconnected existence. Julian had long ago chosen isolation over companionship, music over relationships. He found comfort in the silence that followed his performances, in the empty rooms that echoed with the reverberations of his soul's darkest corners. Yet, as the final chord of his composition hung in the air, something unsettled him. It wasn't the music itself, it never was, but the nagging feeling that his art had stopped being enough. His hands trembled as he sat back, staring at the piano. His past, long buried under layers of self-imposed detachment, had begun to surface once more, like a storm on the horizon, impossible to ignore. The doorbell rang, breaking the oppressive stillness. Julian's heart skipped a beat, an involuntary reaction to the unexpected sound. He hesitated, staring at the door. Who could it be? It had been years since anyone had come to visit him. His concerts were few, private affairs, and his personal life was non-existent. He was a ghost in his own home, and the world outside seemed a distant, irrelevant thing. The doorbell rang again, sharper this time, followed by a soft knock. Julian stood up slowly, pushing the thoughts of his past aside as he moved to answer. He wasn't expecting anyone. There was no one left who would seek him out, no one who would dare to. When he opened the door, the sight of the woman standing there caught him off guard. She was young, with dark hair cascading down her back, and her eyes, wide and earnest, seemed to see right through him. She held a violin case in one hand, and with the other, she offered him a letter. "I'm sorry to bother you," she said, her voice soft but confident. "Are you Julian Frost, the pianist?" Julian studied her for a moment, trying to place her face. She was unfamiliar, yet there was something about her that made his pulse quicken. Her presence was unsettling, as if she had stepped into his world without permission. "Yes," he replied coolly, his tone guarded. "What do you want?" She smiled, undeterred by his icy reception. "My name is Isabel. I'm a violinist. I've heard your music many times, and I was hoping we could talk." The words she spoke felt out of place in the world Julian had so carefully constructed. Music had always been his refuge, his shield against the world. And yet here was the stranger, asking to see beyond the curtain, to understand the very thing he had spent years hiding from. "I don't have time for visitors," Julian said. His voice edged with a hint of finality. But Isabel was persistent. She stepped forward, lifting the violin case slightly, as if to emphasize the shared language between them. "It's not about time, Julian. It's about the music. The music you play is not just notes. It's a story I want to understand." Julian stiffened, his heart racing for reasons he didn't fully comprehend. How could she possibly know what his music meant to him? His compositions weren't just for the world. They were his way of confronting the ghosts of his past, the shadows that had followed him for as long as he could remember. No one had ever looked at him and seen that. They had heard the music, admired the performance, but no one had ever tried to understand the meaning behind it. "You don't understand," Julian said, shaking his head. The music isn't a story. It's a way to escape. Isabel's eyes softened, as though she were seeing something deeper in him than he could see in himself. I think it's both, Julian. It's your escape, but it's also your truth. I've heard it. Your music. It's full of pain, but there's beauty in it. And I want to know what's behind that beauty. Julian's breath caught in his chest. Her words struck him with an intensity he wasn't prepared for. The last thing he wanted was for someone to get close, to pierce the wall he had spent years building around himself. Yet, something about Isabel's presence, her sincerity, made him hesitate. He stood there, at the threshold of his door, battling the conflicting emotions that churned inside him. The walls he had so carefully constructed were beginning to crack, and he wasn't sure if he was ready to face what lay beyond them. "Why are you really here?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "What do you want from me?" Isabel paused, her eyes meeting his. For a moment, Julian thought she might turn away, but instead, she stepped closer, offering the letter once again. "I was sent by the concert hall," she said. "They want to offer you a chance to collaborate with an orchestra. But I think there's more to it than that. I believe your music deserves to be heard by the world. And I think somewhere deep inside you, you want it to be heard." Julian stared at the letter for a long moment, his fingers itching to play, to release the tension that had been building inside him for so long. The idea of collaborating, of sharing his music with others, terrified him. Music had always been his own personal journey, an intimate reflection of his pain and his torment. But Isabel's unwavering gaze held something he couldn't deny, a flicker of something he had long buried, hope. Without a word, he stepped aside, motioning for Isabel to enter. She smiled, grateful, and made her way into the apartment, her violin case still in hand. Julian closed the door behind her, his mind already racing, unsure of what this encounter would bring. He motioned toward the grand piano. "You wanted to hear my music. Take a seat." Isabel glanced at him, then at the piano, as though sensing something deeper in the offer. She nodded, sitting down on the nearby sofa instead. She placed the violin case gently beside her, as though she was waiting for something more to unfold. Julian sat at the piano, his fingers lingering over the keys for a moment before he began to play. The opening chords of a piece he hadn't performed in years filled the room. It was a composition born from a time long ago, when his world had been different, when he had been different. The music flowed, heavy and dark, each note echoing the promises he had made and the promises he had broken. As the piece continued, Julian's thoughts began to drift, and the room seemed to darken around him. The music became a mirror to his soul, a reflection of everything he had tried to forget. Each chord was a reminder of the choices he had made, the people he had lost, the darkness he had invited into his life. And then, in the midst of the music, he felt it, a presence beside him. Isabel had risen from the sofa and was standing by the piano, her violin in hand. Without a word, she began to play, her violin weaving seamlessly with Julian's piano. The sound was ethereal, like the delicate brush of wings against the air. The music intertwined, a duet of shared pain and beauty. It was a language neither of them needed to speak. Their instruments told the story for them, a story neither of them fully understood, but one they both felt deeply. As the final note rang out, Julian's hands trembled. The room was silent once more, the echoes of their shared music lingering in the air. Isabel stood beside him, her breath shallow, her eyes wide with the realization of what they had just created together. "You were right," she whispered. "It is a story." Julian looked at her, his chest tightening. For the first time in years, he felt something stir inside him. The music, the pain, the connection. It was all part of the same truth he had spent his life running from. And now, with Isabel standing beside him, the choice was his, to run again or to face the darkness head-on. The promise he had made long ago was a crimson thread, binding him to the past. But perhaps, just perhaps, Isabel had shown him that he didn't have to face it alone.